how do we decide who gets to run the UK? Well, it's more complicated than you might think. There's voting, manifestos, constituencies, polling stations, ballot papers, the Houses of Parliament, majorities, devolution, number 10. Straight away, this feels like a pretty complicated question, and we've got a lot to cover, so we better get going. First off, we live in a democracy. This means the UK people get to choose who's in charge of their country. We do this by voting in what's called a general election, but not everyone's allowed a vote. First of all, you have to be 18 or over, so people our age don't get to have their say. And you also don't get a vote if you're in prison or if you're a member of the House of Lords. The UK is divided into 650 areas, and these are called constituencies. Some are big and some are small, but they've all got roughly the same amount of people living there. Every constituency has a local member of parliament, or MP, and their job is to represent the people of that local area. So this is who we are voting for in a general election. Most of the people who put themselves forward to be elected are members of political parties, and the two biggest ones are the Conservatives and Labour. But how do people know who to choose? Well, let's get some help on this from an expert. Hi there.
Hi, Scarlett.
Well, voting seems like a really important decision to make. So how do voters decide who they should choose?
It is a really important choice. There's a few things that voters can do. So before an election, for about 5 weeks, there'll be what we call campaigning. And that's where candidates in their local area will be going round doing things like giving out leaflets, talking to people, holding public meetings, and telling voters the sorts of things they would like to do if they're elected.
Well, voters need a lot of information from them in a very short amount of time. Is this even possible?
It's definitely a lot of information, but there are a few things that help make voters' choices a bit easier. So candidates in local areas are members of political parties, and those political parties publish things called manifestos, which are big lists of all the things they would like to do if they're elected. And before an election, on the TV or on the radio, you might hear some short programmes where those political parties talk about their ideas in more detail. They're called party political broadcasts.
So what actually happens on the big day? Well, I've been looking into this. With the entire UK voting to choose their local MP, there's a lot going on. Polling stations pop up across the country, in places like schools and libraries, and these are places where people go to vote. Voters get given what's called a ballot paper. This has a list of all the candidates in their local constituency. They choose one person by putting a cross against their name and then drop their vote into a sealed ballot box. At 10 o'clock at night, the voting stops and the counting begins. The candidate with the most votes in each constituency wins. But what does this mean for the UK as a whole? So, can you help us with this one?
I will try, Scarlett. So, after the election, the successful candidate in their local area becomes a Member of Parliament, an MP. That means they go to work in the House of Commons, where they do things like look at laws the government wants to pass and debate important issues.
But who becomes the Prime Minister?
Great question. So usually, the leader of the biggest political party in the House of Commons is invited by the King to form a government. That means they become Prime Minister and they get to live in 10 Downing Street.
Well, I've heard people talking about political parties needing to have a majority. What does this mean exactly?
A majority means that one political party in the House of Commons has more MPs than all of the other political parties put together. And you get that if you get 326 MPs. Sometimes, though, this doesn't happen after an election. What that means is the different political parties have to see if they can work together and agree on what they want to do. But if they can't, that could mean there's another election.
Whatever government is eventually formed, is the decision-making for the whole of the UK based in London?
It isn't, no. So, historically, London was the place from which all UK-wide decisions were made. But from the late 1990s onwards, voters in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland went ahead with something called devolution. And what that means is that governments in those parts of the UK have power to make policy in some specific areas. So, for example, in Scotland, they decide how they want to run their schools.
That's all been so helpful. Thank you for taking the time to help us understand how it all works.
You're welcome, Scarlett.
So general elections, there's a lot to take in, isn't there? But it feels really important to understand how it all works. And it's exciting to know that once we're old enough, our vote could have a big impact on the way the UK is run.